I was having a conversation with the CEO of the largest credit bureau in the continent. And we were having a particular conversation about how the world of technology and data has gotten into this really interesting space where all of a sudden it impacts the world of the real world, in particular the real economy, right? And so it's often IT, and I'm old enough to remember a time, technology was something, first it was called the IT department, and it was something that had like the basement somewhere. So there was a basement somewhere, and really their job was to make sure that emails were working, and that if you had some sort of platform for sharing information, we in the first organization I worked with was called DAWA, a data warehouse. That if you had that, that it was kept up to breast and gave you decent uptime. So that's kind of like the legacy if you really think about the role that tech and technology has played. But today we're in this very interesting space where technology is not just in the boardroom, but technology is the boardroom. It's shaping an awful lot of strategy. It's shaping an awful lot of leadership conversation. And if you talk to any leader today of a large multinational and ask them what are the three things keeping them up at night, one of those three will definitely be something to do with an element of technology, whether it's around digitization, automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, data and data breaches. There is a myriad of conversationing to be had about the role of information and data. So that's at like the mad macro level, right? And if you drill down and you get into the nub and crux of it, you also have, in our particular context, a continent where the overwhelming majority of citizens have not yet felt the full impact of the technological advantage. That's just a statement of fact. So, for instance, if you think about the way we do something like voting, right? If you think about the way we deliver services, the way citizens pay for services, if you think about the way citizens interact with public officials, and the way citizens interact with basic public goods, healthcare, education, infrastructure, those we're still running on this really old, archaic model of how they should be run. We're not really thinking about how does technology help morph that. And where we are thinking about it, there's a huge amount of resistance. And in truth, too, not only resistance, but also, I think, a lack of coordination and collaboration. And then in the middle, you find a very small community of us, but I imagine it's a lot of the people who are in this conversation. So in the middle, you find all of the people who are the evangelists. These are the people building the technology, building the back end, building the platforms. And all of us are absolutely obsessed. We believe that the future has a technological leverage, right? And so 10 years ago, we thought technology was the answer. Now we know that technology is what enables the answer. So we know, for instance, that if you want to make financial services more inclusive and more affordable, that the laying out of brick and mortar infrastructure is not as effective as laying out a network of technological infrastructure to include the unbanked, underbanked, uninsured, underinsured, and you could just keep going with the various iterations of what exists in the financial services space. So the question then for us is this: how do we optimize the work I think that we're doing first? Second, how do we ensure that the future of the work that we're doing allows us to be globally competitive? I'll come back to that in a minute because I think that there is a huge gap there. I think one of the things we're doing is we're spending so much time playing catch up. We're not really thinking about, once we've caught up, at which point do we catch up and where would the world be at that time? There's almost this presumption that as we're playing catch up in the various sectors of technology, for instance, just this morning, I was looking at a very interesting drone business. It's not the kind of thing we would do, but it came across my table. And I was looking at the back end, the dev, the way they collect data. They're in the agricultural space. I thought it's a very interesting play. But one of the things about it that I thought was also interesting was if you map it relative to global competitors, their tech stack and their development timeline, as well as that development waterfall, kind of presupposes that their global competitors are going to stay stagnant. And so the point is that we know that that's not the case. And that's the second thing I'll hope to do in a minute. And then the third is to have a conversation about what will it take to lead in this new construct, in this new world? How do we need to show up, really to ensure that we give optimal value to our network, to our clients, and to the people that we're working with every day? So first, to go back to that original point, and that original point, if you remember, was, so where is the opportunity, right? Where really is the opportunity? And I think if you look at the complexion of the broad spectrum, so Africa, what was now 2016 was 1.1 billion people. We're 1.3 billion as we speak. So over the past 5 years, we've seen a growth of about 400 and something million people in the population growth of our continent. The rate of growth in our continent is unbelievable. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make, which is no less important, by the way, is that even with that growth of population, there isn't a consistent, or rather a similar growth in availability of resources to deliver our services to those citizens, right? So for instance, there's a very interesting study done by an infrastructure company called Big N. And what they did, the good people at Big N Africa, was they looked at the growth in population and they mapped it. And then they looked at the growth in physical infrastructure. So these would be ports, railways, highways, etc. And you just see this like massive schism develop, right? Where the population growth continues to do this, but there is not a commensurate investment in the underlying infrastructure that would enable the people of those economies to thrive. So the point is that the work I think we need to do is actually work around collaboration. In part, to collaborate, we also need to have real, honest conversation about where we find competitive advantage. And I think that's an important conversation. It's a difficult conversation. It's an unpopular conversation, but it's a necessary conversation. I notice in my country, South Africa, where I am based, but also for context, our firm has offices around the continent. In fact, we're in South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. We've just announced that we've opened an office or bought into a business in Uganda, and we're in London and New York, right? So we use kind of our London office. We do a lot of compliance work in the London office. We do capital raising in our New York office, and then we do the actual delivery in continent, in country. But one of the things I notice is that if you look at the comparative advantages of each of the different countries in the continent, everybody has a different play. So for instance, the mineral industrial complex of different countries is different. That presents different opportunities in terms of how those countries can compete in the rest of the world. This is economics 101. What does it have to do with us? Well, I think what it has to do with us is this, that in part the role we need to start thinking about playing is how do we become the enablers of macro comparative advantage conversations in our countries. So in our firm, for instance, we're busy raising our third fund, which is a purely financial services fund. What we've really noticed we're good at is like we're great at allocating capital into the financial services space and finding new plays that are going to be disruptive into that financial services space. So that's kind of the direction where we're going with Fund 3. The point I'm making is this, that if you consider that and you consider what that means, it means that as a firm, we now have to look at who in the ecosystem are the best people to partner with across the continent in leveraging technology for scale and impact in the financial services sector, rather than reinvent the wheel. So our full approach is how do we go into markets and identify real life partners. About a week ago, I met with an incredible young man who runs an accelerator in Tanzania. We had one of these Zoom meetings, as is the case here, but he runs an incredible incubator in Tanzania. And he has a program for fintech. And I said to him, well, this is great, but that's just fintech. You know, what about insurtech? What about regtech? What about legtech? Like there's a whole host of other techs that you can bolt on. And then he sent me literature about the past, and would you believe it, the past 11 programs that they've run. And going through those reports, I realized then, and it's the comment I'm making now, that it would take us 5 years at best incredible amount of time and resources to build up the knowledge capital that he already has resident built in his firm. But of course, he, like most of us, is thinking in territorial terms. He's thinking quite provincially, and I think we tend to do that as occupants of a particular space. We like to be provincial in our thinking. So he's thinking about Dar, as they call it, Dar es Salaam, or Tanzania broadly. But he's not really thinking East Africa. That's a big conversation. He's definitely not thinking Sub-Saharan Africa. So my conversation with him is, well, how do we leverage the work you're doing and give you spread and access to the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, so that by the time we have conversations with global DFIs, the conversations are substantive and meaningful? Like, how do we do that? Because that, for me, is the stuff that's important. Any of you in the conversation who've ever sat with somebody from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or USAID, or IFC, or FMO, or the CDC, or NORSAT, SWED Fund, you would know that one of the difficulties you come upon when you talk to those institutions is quite simply that, as in small countries, we tend to be too small to make for a real business case around the deployment of capital, but that if we aggregate it ourselves, there's much more opportunity. So the point, we have to start talking about how do we build live comparative advantage by region, right? Now, in my mind, there is no denying that if you think about the role technology plays in the rest of the world, and whether or not Africa has been able to play an export role in the rest of the world, well, with respect, Cape Town has kind of got that nubbed. This is why Amazon set up in Cape Town. But if you think about the role technology has played in transforming the lives of ordinary people in the continent, what I call decoupling of the complex language of technology into the everyday meaningful stuff, well, you can't touch the East Africans. They're just far and away in terms of that conversation. So if this is true, and it is, then the question becomes, so how do we collaborate to work together, right? If you're looking at what's been happening in the mineral industrial complex, so if you look at what's happening in mining, look at what's happening in terms of not only mining, but also the bolt-on industries. So you've got mining and all the beneficiation industries, production, logistics, transportation, all of those are also looking at very real opportunities to morph, to shift, to change, to become globally competitive. Because they've got clients on their end who are saying, well, you've got to be globally competitive too. And so there's a huge opportunity then that develops around industrial technology and industrial technology applications. But who in the continent is playing in that space? And who has the comparative advantage? One of the things I think we need to do, and just as a final point on this, is we need to dedicate some time to asset mapping, because I don't think we've done so. In fact, I know we haven't done so. It's a program actually that I've been in chat with one of the large DFIs about, is maybe we need to just do a proper asset mapping exercise. So at last count, I think they said there's something like 400 accelerators, incubators in the continent. I mean, that's an unbelievable number. 55 countries, at 400, you're talking close on about eight per country. That's a lot. That's a lot, especially when you consider the rate at which we're contributing to the global technology complex. So I think the work we need to do, in part there, just to end off that point, is we've got to do some work to asset map. Map assets, map infrastructure, map who's doing what, right? So that we can know who to bolt on to which platform and at which point. Having made that point, I want to come to my second point. And the second point is around the loop that we're following and the trajectory that we're following in terms of the work we're doing as a community, right? I wonder if any of us in this conversation are aware of what is the genesis of VC. This was something that had been bugging me for a while. So I just, you do a Google check and it'll pull up the article. So I started doing some research on where does VC come from, right? And there was a reason for this. I wanted to understand what was happening in the environment at the time that the occupants of that environment constructed something like VC, whether by design or default. And then having done so, what has happened since that it has matured the way that it's matured? If you talk to the average founder of a high growth startup in the continent, they typically tend to fall into three boxes. Those who are not yet fundable, which are, in my view, a small minority actually. Those who are attracting all of the capital, which in my view is a small minority as well. And then that big gap in the middle, which are those who don't fit the VC risk matrix of investing in those businesses, right? Because if you're a VC using private equity principles, you're a limited fund with limited fund terms, you're running an in commandante partnership, so you've got limited partners to whom you're reporting, general partners that are managing the structure, and you're typically going to be in that fund for 5 years with an additional 2 years to exit. That's a 7-year play. But in 7 years, Facebook went from 0 to 0 in revenues. So if revenues was the measure by which you did evaluation on Facebook, it was worth nothing at the beginning and worth nothing at the end. And that's in the world's most advanced economy, with the world's largest middle class and the world's largest advertising industrial complex. 7 years, 0 to 0. But here we are, and we go to these businesses in the middle and we kind of go, well, in that time, I need you to get product market fit. I need you to build a good team. I need you to scale really quickly. And by scale here, I mean grow your community. Oh, and I need you to figure out the revenue model. And I need you to implement that revenue model, monetize, and potentially become cash flow positive. And so what happens then is these businesses in the middle, entrepreneurs and founders in that space find it very difficult to attract the kind of capital that would help them to build those businesses. It's a real issue. And what I think we need to do is, rather than talk about whether or not the instruments of venture capital, which is space that I play in, it's my forte, it's what I do, but the instruments of venture capital, rather than talk about whether or not these instruments are effective, maybe we need to talk about what does an effective venture capital ecosystem look like for us. Maybe that's the conversation, right? So for instance, today, I've got 2 term sheets sitting on my table right now. You can't do a deal without a convertible note. But nobody's really thought about why a convertible note. When did the convertible note become the thing to do? And in different parts of the continent, you find different regulatory environments. So for instance, in Mauritius, they have an RSL, a regulatory sandbox license, and they allow you the space to create technologies, beta and test them within a protected regulatory sandbox, so that you don't have to worry about complying with the broader regulations, particularly in spaces of high compliance, insurance, financial services, etc. Great, but how do the people in Mauritius and the people building technologies and businesses in Mauritius leverage that to help them build a globally competitive ecosystem that doesn't just meet where the world is today in 5 years' time, but meets the world where the world is in 5 years' time? We have a fund that we run, which is a complete innovation fund between ourselves and Huawei. We announced it months ago, actually. But even if you look at the structure of that and the way that fund works, it works purely because partners in that particular fund were driven by trying to localize insights and understanding of applications for technologies, right? So what they're saying is, look, we have these amazing people that are building like these incredible technologies all over the world. I mean, we're one of the fastest growing tech companies in the world. We're Huawei. I think they might be is it the first or the second largest company in terms of the number of patents registered over the past year. Like, phenomenal. Just the amount of money they're throwing into this thing is unbelievable. So they're going, we've got this amazing space where we're building all this technology. But what we've noticed is there's typically a lack to connect. In tech, we call it the middleware, right? But there's a lack of space where we're connecting this amazing stuff we're doing with the environment that we're operating in. And so what we need is a partner in country, local, who understands the nuance, the insights, and who can build for us a community of founders who are willing to use the platform that we've created to build on that platform, to build systems, tools, technologies, and applications that are going to work and make life a more meaningful experience for ordinary citizens, right? So that work is happening. Now, the point I'm making is that the challenge we have with the participants in that program is go, look, you can't build this thing for where they are now. You got to build this thing for where they are in 5 years' time. And if you follow the growth of that ecosystem, the growth of the number of handsets they've got out there, and it's just the upside potential is unbelievable. So as you're working now, how do you get there then? And I think we have a lot of work to do, if we're to be honest with ourselves about how much work we have to do to get to that point. Just that point where everybody is clear, everybody understands, everybody knows, and everybody is deeply engaged in the process of doing what we're committed to be doing. And then the third and final comment. And so the third and final comment, if you remember, was, so what are we actually trying to do here? What's the legacy? I want to pause here for a minute. This morning I had a meeting with my coach, and my coach is a very difficult guy. Which is why it works, I suppose. He calls a spade a spade. He, tells me crap all the time, type of thing. Sorry, my son's calling. Yes, my boy? Okay, daddy's coming now. I'm almost finished. Go ask Bunny to help you, please. Okay. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, but we're kind of all used to working from home. So right now. And here is the question. The question is this. At some point in future, people will meet and they will sit and gather and talk about you. And they'll talk about the life that you lived. They'll talk about the impact that you had. And they'll talk about the world the way it was when you inhabited it. And the question to ask ourselves is, will those conversations be kind? Will they be positive, right? The way he asked me the question is the way I'd like to ask you the question. And the question was this: are you living a 10x life? And it's an important conversation in the context of this, because at the end of the day, whilst we all are financiers, technologists, bureaucrats, technocrats, all of us, I think, would like to leave a message and a legacy that's greater than ourselves. So the question is, are you living a 10x life? I think most of us live a 1x life. I think the outliers are about 1.5x. So what would it take to live a 10x life? What would that take? First, it takes leverage. See, the only way to multiply your impact by a multiple of 10 is literally if there are 10 of you in the world. And the question I'm asking here is this, is how many of us are actively working on a program to creating 10 more of us? I mean, I know we are all completely seized with the work of surviving COVID and making sure that our businesses survive COVID and that we retain our clients and we keep our value proposition, strong. And I get it. But how many of us are truly creating and leaving imprints of ourselves in the world that allow others to carry on with a positive impact of the work that we're doing? For me, the pivot and the change happened, if I'm to be honest, around the 3rd month into lockdown. Unable to travel, unable to be in country. I'm quite a hands-on guy. I love being in country, meeting people, doing the thing. I love that, right? And I noticed my inability to be in country doing that stuff put me in a position where I all of a sudden had to ask myself the question, have I created the environment for the people around me to be able to do the stuff that I would ordinarily do? So have I allowed myself to move from, as Jim Collins calls it, a level 3 leader to a level 5 leader, right? And the question I'm asking for all of us in this conversation is, are we doing that? Are we doing the 10x work? Are we leveraging our networks? Are we improving the ecosystem, even if it doesn't benefit us? And are we leaving the place we found a better place than we found it? And to do that requires of us, which is the second thing I wanted to share, courage. Courage. By definition, anytime you look to do new things, you have to recognize that the people used to having things done the old way are going to have a response to that. And it tends to be quite a visceral response. I speak from experience. So what you're looking for here then is to have the courage to follow through on what you know is the possible thing to do. I know it's not easy, but it's the thing to do. Raj has just asked a question, and I'm cognizant of time. Raj says, there are so many incredible entrepreneurs. The biggest challenge seems to be connecting good entrepreneurs to the right investors and the right capital at the right time. Raj, I think you're 100% on the money. But Raj, I'm going to make an even more controversial statement. We don't have a problem of good entrepreneurs. We have a problem of good investors. We don't have a problem of businesses that are investment ready. We have a problem of investors that are business ready. For me, that's the way we need to think about this problem. This idea that there is a watermark that every single business needs to meet, because that's the global standard before they become fundable, is what we need to change. And maybe what we need to start thinking about is, we know what venture capital looks like, term sheets and, due diligence, we know. But what does venture capital in the continent look like? What does seed and pre-seed funding in the continent look like? What does angel funding in the continent look like, right? What does that look like? And how do we model it for ourselves? And so I'd like to leave it there and just say, I hope that those ideas and thoughts are ideas and thoughts that have added value to this conversation. Very happy to take on more questions. But this is, for me, the single quest about which I am completely obsessed. Literally, everything I'm doing every day is just about this. How do we look at the ecosystem, map it, collaborate, coordinate, and connect, and having done that, amplify? And that work is hard work. It's dog work. It's foundation work. I gotta tell you, it's exhausting. Yesterday I was going through 3 startup acts from 3 different countries to try and understand the different nuances in each of these. But it's incredibly fulfilling. And I think if we get it right, it'll set an amazing foundation for future generations. So those are my thoughts. Thank you so much, host. I'll hand over back to you. Just as a final thought for you on that comment, we have to think of ourselves as, wait, let me just say very quickly, I know we're thin on time, but I just want to make this comment. If you study every single civilization, there's always that, in Afrikaans in South Africa, we call them voortrekkers, pathfinders, right? Who created the world as we see it today. In the US, in the rush for gold in the Midwest, it became the wild, wild West, right? And if you think about the growth of different economies and how they've grown, it's always because there was a generation that dared to venture when nobody else would go. I think we need to think of ourselves as that. We have to recognize we are the Pathfinder generation. We are the version 1s. So let's act as version 1s. And what are the rules for version 1? Well, there are no rules. It's version 1, right? So let's act like that so that we can be the platform that builds the future. So it's interesting, it's exciting. I think there is a lot to do. I still think the fact that Africa is right in the middle of 2 of the world's greatest superpowers fighting each other out. If you look geographically, We're right in the middle of the US and China, right? We're like right in the middle. That presents, again, just there's so much opportunity for us to really start thinking about what do we bring to the global stage. We know that the 20th century was built on an industrial complex that was extractive, and so Africa became the place where there was an extract of resources and an extract of talent, but there wasn't a reinvestment of either, right? We have to think of ourselves in the 21st century and go, how do we make sure that technology doesn't do the same thing again? That technology doesn't simply come into Africa and extract talent, or come into Africa and extract capital, or come into Africa and extract resources. How do we make sure that that doesn't happen? How do we ensure that we have a net neutral platform that allows an African child growing up anywhere who has a little bit of brain and an awful lot of tenacity and hard work to be able to play on the global stage of technology with peers from all around the rest of the world? To do that, we have to recognize we are the pathfinder generations. There are no rules but the rules that we write. We are version 1. So what rules are we writing? You've had me here. I'm happy to connect with everybody who's in this conversation. I've seen a couple of you inbox me already on LinkedIn. Again, I think I've shared at length the work that I'm doing. I'm very happy to carry on and coordinate and collaborate and work together, really to just try and build. We're 2 capital raisings happening. We're raising this fintech fund. We're raising an Africa fund of funds. So there's a lot happening, and I'd love to connect with everybody in the conversation on LinkedIn and on all the socials, and just talk a bit about what does the future look like and how do we actualize the conversations we've been having over the past day. For too long. So thank you so much for this, guys. It's been amazing.